Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another video lecture for Psych 370. This one is another excerpt from a Zoom class, and in it, I'm going to be talking about basically what gets associated with what in operant conditioning. So it's an associative form of learning, right? But what's the nature of that association? Now, I told you in a previous video lecture that in operant conditioning, we learn to associate our behaviors with their consequences, and that's definitely true, but it's not quite the whole story. So the actual association that we learn in operant conditioning is a bit more complicated than that, because whether or not the consequence occurs doesn't only depend on whether or not the behavior occurs. So that behavior also has to occur under the right circumstances. It has to occur in the right situation at the right time. And so because of that, guys, operant conditioning actually involves a 3-term association, not just a 2-term one like classical conditioning does. So in classical conditioning, you learn to associate the CS with the US, right? The contingency in classical conditioning is a 2-term contingency. It's just if the CS occurs, then the US occurs. That's the contingency, right? But in operant conditioning, it's a 3-term contingency. We have what we call a 3-term contingency in operant conditioning because there's a behavior, there's a consequence, and there's also what we call a discriminative stimulus, okay, or an SD. The discriminative stimulus, okay? So what we're talking about there is a stimulus, something in the environment that allows you to discriminate. It allows you to distinguish between situations where a behavior will produce a certain consequence and situations where it won't. Okay. That's why we call it a discriminative stimulus, because it's a stimulus that you use to tell the difference, to discriminate between times where a behavior will get reinforced or punished and times where it won't. Okay. So it's a pretty important concept, right? Discriminative stimuli play a very important role in operant conditioning because, again, if you want to bring about a certain consequence, if you want to obtain a certain reinforcer, then you don't just have to know what to do, right? You've also got to know when to do it. And that's where discriminative stimuli come into play. They basically let you know whether or not the time is right to perform a certain behavior. So, for example, if you've got a rat pressing a bar in a Skinner box, then you might set that Skinner box up so that if this light is on, then pressing the bar results in food, okay? But if this light is turned off, then that rat can press the bar all it wants to, and food is never going to come out of the chute, okay? You could do that, right? You could set it up that way. And if you did that, then pretty soon what you'd see is that the rat presses the bar a lot when the light is on and almost never when that light is off. Okay? And so it will learn to discriminate, right? It'll learn to discriminate between situations where pressing the bar gets reinforced and situations where pressing the bar doesn't get reinforced. And the light is the stimulus that it uses to tell those situations apart from one another. So the light is the discriminative stimulus. That's the SD here, okay? Now notice, the light doesn't cause the rat to press the bar, right? The light doesn't elicit that response. It's not a reflexive response to the light, okay? So there's a difference between the conditioned stimulus in classical conditioning and the discriminative stimulus in operant conditioning. All the discriminative stimulus does in operant conditioning is indicate to you whether or not that behavior, if you choose to perform it, will or will not get reinforced. But you've still got to do it. You've still got to choose to perform that behavior. So like I said before, operant conditioning involves a 3-term contingency, right? Not a 2-term one like classical conditioning does. So it's not if the discriminative stimulus occurs, then the consequence occurs, right? Because the animal's got to perform the behavior too. And it's also not if the behavior occurs, then the consequence occurs. That's also too simple because the discriminative stimulus has to be present too. Okay? So the actual contingency, the 3-term contingency in operant conditioning goes like this. If the discriminative stimulus is present and if the behavior is performed, then the consequence occurs. Okay. And guys, a good way to remember how that three-term contingency works in operant conditioning is like this. You can think of it like A plus B equals C. Okay. A plus B equals C. So operant conditioning involves what's often called an ABC association. The B stands for behavior. The C stands for consequence. And the A stands for antecedent, because that's what some people call the discriminative stimulus. They call it the antecedent because an antecedent is something that comes first, right? An antecedent is something that precedes something else, okay? So before you perform the behavior, the discriminative stimulus is already present, right? That's what makes it an antecedent. It precedes the behavior. And then after the behavior occurs, then the consequence occurs, okay? So antecedent, behavior, consequence. That's the ABC association in operant conditioning. Again, A plus B equals C. If the antecedent occurs, if that discriminative stimulus is present, and if the behavior also occurs, then the consequence occurs. Okay? Okay. Well, before we call it a day, I want to give you guys a few more examples of discriminative stimuli here, because that is probably the most difficult concept for people to get in all of this. And then for the last example, I'm going to show you guys a video. I'm going to launch one last poll, and I'll have you identify the discriminative stimulus for that one. Yeah, I'll just talk about these first few examples, though. For this first example, you know, discriminative stimuli are all over the place in video games. Great place to spot discriminative stimuli video, because there's all sorts of actions that you can perform in video games that'll get reinforced in some situations, right? And not in others. So a great example from a classic game, a game from my youth, is this guy. This opponent goes by the name King Hippo, and who you fight in a game called Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. Now, the first time you fight him, he seems to be impossible to beat because he just blocks all your punches, right? So you have to figure out the secret. And the secret is, if you sock him in the face when he opens his mouth and raises his fist like that, then you'll actually land that punch. That's the only time that you'll land that punch. And then he gets sort of stunned, I guess. So you can hit him in the belly a few times. That makes his pants fall down for some reason. And that's how you can knock him out, okay? So only in the presence of that discriminative stimulus, only if King Hippo is doing that, only if you see his mouth open and his fist up like that, that's the only time that that punch is going to get reinforced. Any other time, and you might as well not even bother trying the punch, because he's just going to block it and beat the hell out of you anyway. Okay. So anyway, video games, really good place to spot discriminative stimuli. But also, the people around us can also act as discriminative stimuli. And they often do. Because think about it. The same behavior can produce very different consequences around different people, right? Take swearing, for example. Personally, I can swear with impunity, more or less, when I'm around my friends. I mean, my friends don't really give a shit if I swear or not, right? But do you think I drop a lot of F-bombs when I'm hanging around with my grandma? No, of course I don't, right? Because it might make her sad. She might be disappointed to hear me using such language. I might get a Daniel or something like that, which is when you really know you're in trouble if they go full name on you, right? And so that behavior, swearing, produces different consequences around different people, right? It gets reinforced when I'm with my friends, right? Or at least it certainly doesn't get punished when I'm with my friends. But when I'm with my grandma, it produces a far less reinforcing consequence, which is why I don't do it. Or here's another example. Jokes. You probably know certain jokes that you'll tell around some people, right? Not around others, because different people think different things are funny or appropriate, right? So whether the joke produces the reinforcer of a laugh depends quite a bit on who you're telling the joke to, right? I meant to have these all, I gave away the punchline of my joke, but I'll tell you anyway, I meant to have them show up at different times. So take this joke. How can you tell how heavy a red hot chili pepper is? How can you tell how heavy a red hot chili pepper is? You know how you can tell? It's really easy. You just give it away, give it away, give it away now. I hope you guys get that joke. I hope you know who the Red Hot Chili Peppers are and that they've got this song called Give It Away. But anyway, that's a joke that I would tell and that I have told to my wife because she loves the Red Hot Chili Peppers. So she got the joke, right? But my mom wouldn't get the joke. I'm not even sure she knows who the Red Hot Chili Peppers are, right? So I wouldn't tell her the joke, right? So again, the same behavior, telling the joke in this case, can produce different consequences around different people, right? It has different consequences when you're in the presence of those different discriminative stimuli. Right? And so that's why we do often take present company into account when we decide how we're going to behave. Okay, well, guys, just to make sure that we're good on the concept of a discriminative stimulus, I'm going to play one more video for you. This is one more example of operant conditioning. And then after the video, I'll launch that poll and I'll have you guys identify what the discriminative stimulus is in it. Okay, so here's that video.
Bang! You faker, you faker.
Okay, so what do you think? What is the discriminative stimulus in that example? What's the antecedent there? Yeah, so it's the command, right? When the owner pointed his little finger gun at the dog and said bang, right? That was the discriminative stimulus. So guys, the command in a dog trick is always the discriminative stimulus. If that helps you remember what a discriminative stimulus is, the command in a dog trick is always the discriminative stimulus because it's always what comes first, right? It's always the antecedent. I mean, you give the command, then the dog does the trick, and then you give the reinforcer, the praise, the treat, or whatever. So that dog has learned that if it plays dead after it sees and hears that command, then it gets the reinforcer, right? That's when it gets the treat and the praise. It can't just play dead any old time at once, right? And expect to get a treat. The command has to have been given, that discriminative stimulus has to be present. And it can't just lie there either, right? It's not just going to get the treat automatically after the command. This is operant conditioning, so it's still got to perform the behavior. It's still got to do the trick to produce that consequence. So both the discriminative stimulus and the behavior have to occur for the treat to occur as a consequence. Again, A plus B equals C. Right? If the discriminative stimulus is present, if that antecedent is there, and if the behavior also occurs, then the consequence occurs. Okay, so that's essentially what we learn in operant conditioning. We learn to perform certain behaviors in certain situations, so in the presence of certain discriminative stimuli, and we learn not to perform certain behaviors in the presence of other discriminative stimuli. Okay, well, please do let me know if you have any questions about this stuff, and I hope you have a great day. Take care.